Okay, I realize that the word localization is now completely poisoned and that we can't say. I get it that we can't say localization because the word has been completely poisoned and taken over, but you have to. I feel like I should do a video or a stream or something on this concept because there is no such thing as a accurate, direct translation that doesn't involve localization. Because English and Japanese are not the same. Like, yes does not necessarily mean height. Height does not necessarily mean yes. There are times when, like, you would translate height as huh? You guys wouldn't, like, I understand that you guys would not say translate the meaning, not the words. You wouldn't call that localization. But you have to understand that this is where so many people are talking past each other, because that is localization. That is what it's supposed to mean. Because it doesn't mean that anymore. Like, you're ceding the term. Like, you're giving it away. We're saying that's localization and that's bad. But people in the industry will never understand that because they use the term localization correctly to mean something else. They should put TL notes in games. No, they shouldn't put TL notes in games. Like, you can translate things faithfully and accurately. You can have a faithful and accurate localization. You can translate, because there are times when you will have to change a joke to make sense, so that the joke lands in English and in Japanese the same way. There are times when, like, if people are talking on the phone, there are things that need to be localized or changed because they have to make sense for the point of the story to work. That's not bad. Like, just because localization is now, like, the buzzword, death word of all time, doesn't mean that we have to cede it and give it up to people who are using it for political reasons. Like, just because people are saying, like, oh, we localized it, meaning, you know, rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the communism, doesn't mean that that's the only thing that localization can mean. That's not what it should mean. Like, idioms, yeah, exactly. Like, there's an idiom in Japanese that is like, should spears or arrows fall? And it means come hell or high water. That's fine. That's like, you should change that out. Because if you said, should spears or arrows fall, people in English would be like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. Did they come up with that themselves? Or is that like something that's unique to this setting? They would not get it. They wouldn't get it. And it's not supposed to be something that stands out as a unique saying. It's supposed to be something that is understandable in the target language. So, like, you know, two birds with one stone. Thankfully, that one exists in both languages, like iseki nicho. One stone, two birds, right? I understand, but just not translating something literally should not be called localization. But it used to mean that. That's what it used to mean. It meant giving an accurate translation that also followed the rules of the English. Like, you should obviously keep all of it to an absolute minimum, but it's still localization because it would be different. The reason it's localization is because the line would be different in English compared to what it would be in Spanish or French or German. It has to be localized to that language. So, like, you would not necessarily use come hell or high water in German. You would use a different idiom, right? It's not that you're adapting it to the... there should be a strict line between saying, we had to change this because the culture wouldn't allow it, versus we had to change this because the language wouldn't allow it, right? Yeah. Now it means we had to change it into onigiri because jelly donuts... Yeah, English speakers don't know what onigiri is. Like, that is something I would absolutely say is wrong. But it's not so clear cut, right? It's not like you can just say, oh, what bothers me is people say, we just want direct translations. Just give us a direct translation. Because then people get caught in this trap where it's like, well, if you just translated it one-to-one, it would be stilted and broken. Because they don't understand that that's not true. There's no, like, I will tell you 100%, there is no such thing as a one-to-one translation. So wouldn't it be source text oriented translation? All translation should be source text oriented translation. Target reader translation is bullshit. Like, you should not be. Yeah, it shouldn't. Like, Vlesh, that's the thing, is you get the idea, but it shouldn't be a mess. Like, we shouldn't have to settle for garbage. Right, but EH, what I'm saying is that if we cede the term localization, you give up the ability to argue along those lines. If you say we don't want localization, then you're going to turn a whole bunch of people who are in that space and in that industry into people who are like, well, what the hell are these guys talking about? What do you mean you can't use localization? Of course you have to localize. Translation is localization, right? Yeah, so like Twilight Wolf, like what you're saying is I understand completely. And that's why I'm saying that the linguistic battle here is so important. This happens all the time with leftist aligned people, right? So where they will start using a word or a phrase or a concept, and then people who are more freedom oriented or more on the quote unquote right wing or whatever will immediately cede the language point, right? Ceding language is something you can't do for these arguments, because that is what like social parasites and leftists do. They seize on language and then they turn everything into semantics. So the second that you give up the term localization, they will pounce on it, and they'll take that term and they'll say, oh, you don't want to localize, so you just want to have direct one-to-one stilted garbage? Because you've given up the term localization to them to mean what they want it to mean, when it never did before. In the past, localization never meant rewriting characters to like remove sexism or racism or anything like that. It was not involved in that level of discourse. It never had that implied in it. But if you give that up and say like, oh, we're going to let you have it, then you're losing ground immediately to the concept. Like, the linguistic battle is more important, I would say, than just saying, well, I don't want to use the term localization. Yeah, I understand that people are only recently finding out how bad the localizations were, but it also goes back to, like, this game came out in like 2008 or something, right? So even this back in the day was not like modern, woke, libsock people. And like, it also applies to old shit, or like stuff like Dragon's Dogma 2, where they're just introducing like goofy jokes and stuff, like the early Griffin gets the worm. Like, that doesn't have anything to do with woke. It's just garbage. But if you say, oh, well, it's always been like that, it's just funny. It's just funny. That's what you do for localization. Then you're giving up the meaning of the word. And like, this shit has existed for so long, like Spoony Bard and Woosley back in the day. Like, just because people like that stuff doesn't mean that it's good. Be giving up translation by attributing that translation of meaning to the act of localization? No, because translation is an umbrella term, and within translation you will do some localization, right? If you're drawing a strict dichotomy between the concept of translation and the concept of localization as if they are two different things and not one underneath the other, so translation is the concept, localization is something that happens when you are doing translation. If you are instead saying translation is one thing, localization is another thing, then you've changed the meaning, right? Yeah, nobody uses, that's the thing, it's like nobody uses the term localizer as a derogatory statement who exists in the industry. It is purely on the Japanese, or it's not Japanese, sorry, I was reading chat. It's purely on the online discussion space. Yeah, but they're not different approaches. All good translation will involve some localization, but not all translation will be a localization. It's not always necessary, but it is sometimes necessary. It exists underneath the umbrella of translation. But Evil Minion, like, you can't have idioms that don't make sense. Right? You have to think about it from the perspective of the author, right? Where they didn't intend for a reader to have to, like, look up an idiom in another language in order to enjoy their work. If I was an author and I was writing something, I would want everyone who's reading it ideally to be able to enjoy it in the same way. So, like, the goal of a translation should be that a Japanese player of the original and an English player of the translation could have a conversation in either language and not be confused about what was going on. So if you left in a Japanese idiom, right, and it didn't match, number one, that would cause an English reader to stop and say, huh? I've never heard of this. What does this mean? Whereas a Japanese reader, if I said that wrong, it's an English reader to stop, right? And go, huh? I don't understand this. What does that mean? Whereas a Japanese reader would just read it as the idiom and understand it. So then you run the risk of the English reader thinking that they were getting emphasis on this idiom or that it was something special to that book, right? So we want them to have an equivalent experience, right? So in that sense, the idiom changing is actually not changing it, because the English reader won't stop and wonder why they used that. They'll see come hell or high water. No, but it's not like changing. I have to, like, draw a clear line here. It's not the same as changing ramen to hamburgers, because the meaning is different, right? The meaning of should spears or arrows fall is the exact same, or very, very, very close to come hell or high water. The meaning of ramen and the meaning of hamburger are completely different, right? Because if you say, oh, he was enjoying a ramen for lunch, that implies a whole set of characteristics, right? So, like, that's like sitting at a table, that's noodles, there's steam, there's the experience of eating ramen, which is completely different from eating a hamburger. But come hell or high water versus should spears or arrows fall imply the same linguistic function, right? So they're not the same. It's not the same kind of change. Changing cultural items is different than changing, like, I would never say you should change I would never say you should change some, like going to a shrine for going to church, right? That should never happen. But when you're talking about the language itself, the function of the language is something that should be preserved, not the form. The form is somewhat incidental. Like, the fact that it's written in Japanese should not in and of itself color the experience of reading it. Yeah, exactly. Like what Duck says, there's a Japanese idiom is Buddha's face 3 times, right? He's the patience of a saint, but you would never be able to, right? So if you left it in Buddha's face 3 times, you wouldn't understand that that's supposed to mean patience, right? Now, obviously, there's caveats and times when, like, if somebody makes a joke explicitly mentioning the idiom, then it gets complicated. And that's where, like, translation becomes difficult. Because they're like, if somebody said Buddha's face 4 times or something like that, right? Then it gets hard. And I'm not saying I have a perfect answer to all of those because it depends on context. But the idea that you should never translate an idiom or you should leave the idioms in as they are is something that I can't agree with. Because what I want to preserve is the experience for the people. Yeah, like the person who translated sente kisho, like, which is just first-hand wins, like Shirley wins, to the early Griffin gets the worm, is a moron. It's terrible because it's not what is implied there. If he had said the early bird gets the worm, that would have been almost fine, because that's what that 4 kanji compound means. You know, first move, surely win. Like, the early mover wins, like move fast, you win. That's the meaning, which early bird gets the worm kind of fits. I'm sure there's probably a better one that's a little shorter because senteisho is quite short, but there's a lot of Japanese idioms that are 4 kanji compounds, like jimonjito, which is soliloquy, or jakuniku kyoshoku, which is survival of the fittest. But if you were to leave jakuniku kyoshoku in English as like literally, that would be like weak meat, strong eat. Like the weak are meat for the strong. If you left that in as the weak are meat for the strong, that would be very, very weird. Yeah, there's 4 character idioms. A lot of those come from Chinese, but the pronunciation has become Japanese. Yeah, obviously it's case by case. I'm not saying there's a hard and fast rule, but what I'm saying is that if we cede the term localization, you risk an overcorrection to where people are now saying, and I've seen this where like, well, they should just put in translator's notes just everywhere. But a translator's note, in my opinion, like 99% of the time is a failure of translation because the Japanese reader didn't have a note. Even if it's something cultural that you wouldn't pick up on, and this is one that might be controversial, but if there's something cultural that you wouldn't pick up on, 9 times out of 10, I don't think there should be a note. Because if somebody makes a reference to like, Moby Dick, like from Hell's Hard I Strike at Thee, or whatever the line is, there's not a note in the English saying, hey, this is a reference to Moby Dick, right? So by the same token, in Japanese, if somebody makes a reference to like Murasaki Shikibu or something, right? Or, like Tale of Genji, there shouldn't be a translator's note for that. Yeah, I stab it, the fake Moby fan. Oh no, I've been exposed, right? But I don't think there should be a translator's note for that because even some Japanese people might not realize that the author is making a Murasaki Shikibu or a Tale of Genji reference. It's like you should either you know it or you don't. So that's why I'm generally against translator's notes. Generally, I think if you release like a companion guide or something like explaining it that was outside of the work itself, that would be fine. But I don't like having them in the work itself.